Right, well, this certainly is a case that got people talking. This happened last month. Count Dankula, also known as Meechan, his actual name, was a YouTuber who taught his girlfriend's pet dog to give Nazi salutes in response to such phrases as Zieg Heil and gas the Jews. People reported him. It went viral. And last month, he was found guilty of a hate crime. He was found guilty of communicating a grossly offensive video. And the 30-year-old vlogger is facing sentencing today. He's being sentenced for the crime of making a, pretty bad taste joke. Let's talk about this now with the comedian David Baddiel, who has spoken up, not just online, but in articles as well, about this case. David Baddiel, thank you for joining us.
That's all right. How are you?
Very well indeed. Now, it was particularly interesting that you, among a lot of comedians, chose to speak up, particularly, of course, because of your Jewish heritage. This was a man who was accused of a hate crime, found guilty. Let's face it, it's fairly. A lot of people might well be offended by this video, but I have to say, I felt a little bit guilty at the fact that it was so absurd. When I saw the video, I did find myself laughing. Now, whether someone thinks it's a good joke or a bad joke or a bad taste joke, do you think anyone should be found guilty of a hate crime for making a joke?
Well, it's very complicated, Julia, is the truth, because I absolutely initially didn't think that. I do a show myself about my mother's infidelity and my father's dementia, which tramples all over the line of good taste and offence and all that kind of stuff. And so initially I was very much in support of the Count, partly because I found the video funny. It's definitely funny that a pug does a Nazi salute. That's in the great tradition, to some extent, of making Nazi things funny. It's in the tradition of the producers or the great dictator, or Borat, making fun of anti-Semites by making them look ridiculous. However, the problem is that although I still do essentially support the right to do anything like that, it is a bit more complicated. He was not the Count. He was not charged with making his pug do a Nazi salute. It was specifically the repetition of the phrase "gas the Jews," which he says a lot on it. And again, I didn't have necessarily an issue with that, although I have previously had a chat with that. I was on Ricky Gervais's podcast talking about that, and I remember Ricky saying he could have used a different cue to make the dog do the Nazi salute, and indeed he could.
Yes, if it stuck to the Zieg Heil, then it would just have been about mocking the Nazis. Well, speaking after the verdict, Count Dankula, as you know, his real name, Mark Meechan, he said there's been a huge miscarriage of justice. I think it's a very, very dark day in terms of freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And he's talking about, your intent. The key thing is context and intent. He said they were completely disregarded. And he says, for any comedians making jokes in Britain, I'd be very, very worried about your future because the context and intent, apparently, they don't matter anymore. Now, there's lots of comedy in Britain.
I'm going to complexify it, right?
Okay.
I'm afraid you've got on someone who's going to have a nuanced response.
No, you go for it.
Because the problem is that, yes, that's absolutely right. And if context is disregarded, then Borat singing "Throw the Jew Down the Well," which is online at the moment, becomes a thing that Sacha Baron Cohen should be put in prison for, which is obviously not right. However, the context is very complicated here. Graham Linehan, who's written about this a lot, who wrote Father Ted, he sent me this thing, which is an alt-right website. And one of the things that alt-right website suggests is that if you want to really disseminate very bad Nazi ideas, you should do it under the cover of laughter. It's a kind of manual that says try and be as funny as possible. Of course, we really want to gas the Jews. This is something that you can read online. Now, to be fair to the Count, there's no evidence that he saw this, Count Dankula I'm talking about. And in fact, he's written to me on Twitter to say, oh yeah, that website was something that wrote that after they'd seen mine and other people's stuff, and then nothing to do with me, which is totally a fair enough point of view, and I don't know. But I do, so my basic position is you should be able to do jokes about Nazis. Of course you should. And you don't necessarily even have to have a very high purpose in doing that. Derek and Clive, which was this brilliant thing done by Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, is my favourite thing in the world. And they do a very funny thing where Peter Cook talks about, how Nazi things had influenced him far too much, and it ended up doing terrible things to Jews as a result of it. And there's no higher purpose there. It's just a completely ridiculous way of looking at the whole thing. And you should be allowed to do these things.
Well, that's part of the cost of free speech is that people are going to say things that you don't like. We hear a lot of the phrase now. I see it on Twitter all the time. I fully support free speech, but now you can't, other than you're not allowed to shout fire in a crowded theatre so people don't get trampled to death trying to get out of a theatre which isn't on fire. we try to have very few limits on free speech for this very reason. But there is this new, this sort of new development in recent years. This idea that you have the right not to be offended. You have the right to say, "I don't find that funny. I don't like what you said, and therefore you can't say it." That is creeping in. And if the law is interpreting those sort of hurt feelings, those sensitivities,
I don't
as
think
the
it
law,
is, actually.
you don't think so?
Well, I completely agree with you. That shouldn't be a right, and no one has the right not to be offended. It's complete nonsense. But as far as I understand it, the law in this case, which is a bit arcane, it's some kind of Scottish electronic communications law, is about the idea that you cannot disseminate, which is not about offence, the idea of actively wanting to gas Jews. That's a bad thing, I think, and I don't agree with free speech up to that point. Anyone who actually thinks that should not be allowed to disseminate that idea. The point is, does Count Dankula, Marcus Meechan, actually think that? I actually don't think he does. There is a bit of a slippage, is the problem, between people who think it's funny to say those things and people who actually think it, and that's what people have to be aware of.
Yeah, and that's a difficult nuance that the courts are working with. My guess is we're going to be looking at a suspended sentence, aren't we, to sort of try and sort of dodge the outcry there's going to be on either side of this debate. Can I ask you, find it, everybody? Look, you're a comedian. You know, you've been drugged into this. You've spoken openly. You're very big on Twitter, commenting on issues like this. You've been very big commenting on the issue of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. Now, the rest of the time, you're on tour. You've got this very highly reviewed, very successful tour, My Family, Not the Sitcom. You also write children's books. Birthday Boy is your latest book. Do you find it strange that in 2018 you are finding yourself constantly talking about issues of anti-Semitism?
Yeah, it is a bit strange, and I never really wanted to become kind of Britain's Mr. Jew, as it were. But one of the things about being Jewish and British is that, unlike America, there aren't that many British Jews who are quite open about it and talk about it and use it as part of their comedy voice or whatever. It's basically really sort of me and a couple of other people. As a result, because it's become a big deal recently, partly because of the Labour Party, but also the truth is racism of all sorts, extreme opinions of all sorts, have become a bit more normalised, unfortunately, than they were because of the technology that we now have, where all sorts of really extreme discourse is out there. Then people come to people like me and say, well, what do you think about it? And I have decided to speak about it because otherwise people are very confused and uncertain about what's going on, and I do have a take on it from personal experience.